Hi, everyone. Hi there. So, thank you for coming to this session, for staying at the club, and for thinking about helping us think about a key opportunity to move forward together. That is thinking about small-scale fisheries in Canada. And we're going to be talking about a network that we're building, an ebook. And I just want to start off by saying this isn't the first time someone's talked about small-scale fisheries in Canada. We have people talking about them as early as I can tell in the 80s. This is about talking about small-scale fisheries in Canada in a more robust way, in a hopefully policy relevant, at a policy relevant time, with a lot of voices in the room, both in this actual room and also contributing to some of the initiatives I'm going to be talking about that aren't here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this new network we're building slowly, called Small-Scale Fisheries Canada, or SSF Can. And then we're going to talk about the ebook as a tool, a process to bring people together and really launch everybody moving forward. So when we talk about small-scale fisheries in Canada, the tendency, I think, and it's a good one, is to talk about what they are. Because if we know what they are, then we can compare and we can think about policy. At this moment, we're going to try to resist this a little bit and talk about examples of them as a way to interrogate what they could mean, what they do mean, and how we can build an understanding of it moving forward. And you can think about all sorts of examples: treaty fisheries, in terms of food, social, and ceremonial fisheries, moderate livelihood fisheries. We have Indigenous fisheries working on Great Lakes and freshwater inland deltas and connected to the prairie provinces. Independent harvesters operating on the Pacific coast in a system of ITQs. So we heard that Madeline Hall Arbor, owner-operator fishers working in that larger system. That's one way to look at them too. And of course, perhaps the more quintessential for people here, top of mind, the inshore fisheries. And we can maybe think of them as the more smaller inshore fisheries. That's what we're hearing anyways, as examples of small-scale fisheries. And I'm doing this work with Christine Knott and Alatamachi Pegdi. And of course, it's turning out to be, at least now, around 85 people from across the country. And where do we find these people? Well, in some ways, we called them up. I knew some people working on fisheries, maybe thinking of them as small-scale fisheries. And we said, okay, well, let's come together and see if we can start to talk about and across these different fishery examples. And we're doing this, which is really the TBTI way, I call it, which is building from the ground up through authentic voices, bringing those people together for different processes towards different outputs towards the goal of a future for small-scale fisheries made possible by sustaining communities, building advocacy, and transdisciplinary science with an eye on changing governance. So that brings me to this ebook. Do you want to put up that slide? Do you mind? Thank you. That brings me to this ebook. The ebook is called Thinking Big About Small-Scale Fisheries in Canada. And this is really about bringing together a bunch of people who care, who are already thinking big, who together help us think even bigger. We call this an ebook soft launch, and it's soft because actually there's no ebook yet. So it's super soft. Okay. We have, at this moment, 20 chapters and that are baked and nearing being iced. We have 4 or 5 more that are promised that are in different stages of development. And I hope some more from many of you. We have, instead of like an edited volume, for example, we've asked people for their stories to share them in the way that they feel is right. We allow for all sorts of things. We have stories from individual fishers who are talking about how in the Northwest Territories that the summer is their time to fish, talking about those practices and how they're shaped with knowledges and how they view fisheries. We have people from different nations in Canada talking about how they want to do small-scale fisheries research, how they like small-scale fisheries research, but they don't want it about them without them. We have all sorts of stories from coast to coast and everything in between, as well as research perspectives on from some of the greatest, I call them the greatest Canadian fisheries researchers around, and I'm still trying to entice a few more of them. They're everybody that you know, who are sharing their perspectives on BC fisheries, on gender and fisheries, on labor, on occupational health and safety, on too-wide seeing, on rights, on governance, on conflict, on recreational fisheries embedded in other fishery systems, on fish stock health, and of course on the future. So it is a beautiful emerging mosaic about small-scale fisheries that's going to just create this space for us to step together, is my hope. And where we're going to go with this is, of course, first trying to entice some more submissions. Then we're going to be meeting the next step tomorrow morning at 9. You're welcome. If you have other plans, reach out to me and we can meet one-on-one. We're going to do some academic-y things. So try to earn some funding, win some funding so that we can keep bringing people together. We're also going to be focused on what different fisheries needs, and we're going to hear from someone like Evelyn Pinkerton, who's going to be talking about learning across some different fisheries, as well as other speakers today. So the future is really about building on what has been done before, and building on the collective wisdom and expertise of the contributors now and also in the next few months. And so today what I hope to do is to give you a little teaser from the book by inviting a few authors to share their perspectives from the book. I will say that in every single parallel session, almost every single parallel session, excuse me, there is a chapter from this book being represented, with the exception, of course, from some of those organized sessions. Those concurrent sessions with individual presentations have representation from this book in here. So not all of the voices in the chapter are going to be here today. This is just a sampling, a teaser. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first sample, which is Kirsten Bradford and Sarah Harper. We're going to talk about gender and fisheries for a brief time.
Thank you, everyone. So my name is Sarah Harper, and I'm presenting just a snippet from the chapter that I developed with Kristen Bradford and Caitlin Snyder. And they couldn't be here today, so I'm presenting on their behalf, but we put together a little video. Unfortunately, Caitlin was a fisher person, was out fishing, so she wasn't able to have her voice in here, but her voice is definitely woven into the messages. So I'm just going to read to you, we included a positionality statement at the beginning of our chapter, which is actually fairly common practice in feminist methods.
Can you speak up just?
Oh, sure. I thought there was a microphone. I guess there isn't. I'll just stand up because I don't have a loud voice. So I'm going to read out the positionality statement that is included in the chapter. And this is something that is often included in sort of feminist work, maybe a little bit more so also in social science practices, much less so in fishery science, although I think we can all, understand that we all come from our own position and our own identities shape that position that we come to this work from. So I'll just read to you what we wrote and then we'll go into the little video clip. So the insights we present in this chapter are drawn from a combination of personal experiences, published literature, and trusted media sources. Kaylin Sider is a fish harvester from Sointula, BC, a settler fishing community in the unceded traditional and ancestral land of the Kwakiutl, Mamalikala, and Nimkish First Nations. Through the summer months, she fishes commercially out of Sointula, and in the winter, she works as a community development director for Tibak Suzuki Environmental Foundation, and as a coordinator for the BC Young Fishermen's Network. Kirsten and myself are both interdisciplinary fisheries scientists and settlers located on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And together we uphold the voices that we present in this chapter while acknowledging that some of the topics that we express go beyond our own lived experiences and expertise, but wherever possible, we've tried to include direct quotes from people to represent their points and amplify the voices of the women who were writing on behalf of, not on behalf of, but trying to represent in this work. So without further ado, I'll show you the little video clip.
Women contribute to small-scale fisheries in Across the globe, women contribute to small-scale fisheries in diverse ways. While much of the research on gender and small-scale fisheries has taken place outside of North America, particularly in the Global South, our chapter highlights research and experiences of women in Canadian small-scale fisheries. With this work, we hope to make the point that gender inequalities exist in all countries and contexts, and that specific attention is needed to avoid deepening existing or creating new gender inequalities. For example, on the Pacific coast of Canada, recent coverage has brought to light the experiences of women fisheries observers who face sexual harassment, assault, intimidation, and threats while working on board.
Our chapter specifically discusses women in small-scale fisheries management across Canada. Women's active participation in management is critical to create both sustainable and equitable outcomes. We discuss how women's involvement is critical because women often have different experiences, leading to different knowledge and management priorities. We also highlight how supporting women's involvement is critical because gender diversity in fisheries management can lead to stronger leadership and better innovation. There are, however, several barriers to women's participation in fisheries management. For example, despite women's increasing participation in the workforce over time, caregiving and domestic responsibilities and unpaid work in the community continue to fall disproportionately on the shoulders of women. This may in turn lead to women having less access to education and training opportunities, with implications for their involvement in management. The gendered power dynamics that are often reflected in the fisheries management spaces is another major barrier to women's participation in management, especially women whose intersecting identities create even more barriers.
While Canadian fisheries policy is beginning to consider gender by engaging policy analysis tools such as Gender-Based Analysis Plus, sound implementation grounded in intersectional approaches is still far from a reality. So, how do we advance gender equality in small-scale fisheries management in Canada? We recommend working across institutions to dismantle systems of oppression, addressing gender bias and harmful social norms. recentering the voices and experience of Indigenous women in fisheries, collecting, analyzing, and making available fisheries data disaggregated by gender, and developing inclusive policies and programs where women and gender diverse people are supported to participate in management.
So I won't say too much more. I'll encourage you to read the chapter when the I don't know what you call it when it actually comes out, not the soft launch.
The harder launch?
The hard launch. When I throw it out there for the world. But I just want to end by saying that, in many parts of the world, and much of my research on gender and fisheries has come from other parts of the world, but the issues really do transcend boundaries and geographies, and they are different in different contexts, but a lot of gender equality exists, inequalities exist sort of across the globe. But one thing that I've heard sort of time and time again is that women really are the backbone of many fishing communities, and I think that's true in Canada and in the US as much as it is elsewhere in the world. And we heard from Madeline Hall Harper this morning about the women in New Bedford and how they really are doing all these different things and are not often recognized, and that has policy implications. And so I'll just kind of put it out there as a call to all of us to kind of make sure that we put those different lenses on our work to see, what is being represented, who's being represented, and who isn't. So, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take those now or after I go.
So if you have a question or two, we can go now for you. I will say this is much easier than bringing in the piano to play it behind you in person. Or
Really glad to see this chapter. I'm just wondering about the operator policy that we're talking about, and the extent to which there is, in fact, on that. I'm thinking, for example, the requirement that you be on the boat, the holder of the license, let's say, with the holder of the license, they not be able to vote.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Do you use gender
The department hasn't even done a race analysis, plus I don't know. I mean, to your specific question, I know we have been looking at substitute operator policies, and there have been, at least in some regions, like parental leave provisions where you could have some other points that we also did not. And I can't remember though whether that's universal and where it doesn't exist right now. But I think even more broadly though, like your point about kind of if you're someone who's more character-based responsibility, maybe that means you are less able to get on a boat and put yourself with an operator that require you to do absolutely something on it. So even if we have like maternity leave or parental leave built in, for sure, you have to apply for that, and it would be with a certain level of time. So you may not be the kind of flexibility to still need to have more responsibilities.
Well, one thing that's come up in the around various things, and I think that is definitely an issue. Like I noticed, during the pandemic, I was like, oh, I could go to all these like I agree that it's an act in all that like the other day that we're thinking about barriers to like the. Is that fair?
Is this a quick one?
I'll make it quick.
Yeah.
It's
you.
mostly a comment when you pointed out how women can or often are the backbone of fishing communities. The success of a project that I worked on in the Philippines sort of really recognize that when we started just by working with the fish harvesters who were predominantly male, we were making certain progress in terms of, doing gear inventories and figuring out how to support a community-based management plan. But it wasn't until we involved the whole of the community and realized that the women in the community we were working were involved in gear manufacture, gear repair. They were the ones who marketed the fish that their partners caught, that we really had a community management plan that reflected the needs of the fishing system in those communities. So I guess I don't really have a question. It's more of a comment that I think when we're talking about barriers, failure to include all of the community, including women in the community, is itself a fundamental barrier.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, so reflect before the meetings and see how to. I mean.
Thank you so much to Kirsten Bradford, Caitlin Snyder, and Sarah Harper. Precisely the kind of conversation we're hoping to start, one of them with this book, to take a chapter with examples from BC, although with a Canadian vision, then to relate them to a situation in Atlantic Canada, and then see what comes up when we start to work across these different types of fisheries in Canada. And we're going to go to a different perspective now, one that was brought up in the plenary session yesterday, a legal perspective, plenary session just earlier on governance. This is a legal perspective brought to us by researcher / lawyer, Nate Stanley.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nathan Stanley. I think like most people who are speaking at this conference here over the next couple of days, I have you for about maybe 7 to 8 minutes, and if I could lock the doors, I'll keep you for a couple of days. I'll try and keep it quick and informative and just sort of go over the chapter that we're doing. My name is Nathan Stanley. As Evan mentioned, I'm a lawyer at the moment in Halifax. I've been a practicing lawyer for just about a year now. I did my article in Halifax, law school in Halifax as well. Before that, I did my undergrad at Memorial University School of Music. And during every summer at MUN, I would be out sailing or doing adventure tourism or just trying to find some way to stay on the ocean as much as possible. So the moment I finished my undergrad, I went right to the Marine Institute and I took the Office of the Watch program. I stopped halfway through, it was a little too much ocean. I spent 3.5 months on board an oil tanker in the Arctic without a break, and I think that sort of made my decision for me. I really like pen and paper, but I did have my bridge watch rating, so I worked as a deckhand with the Coast Guard while I was studying for the LSAT, and then went on to law school. And now I practice in maritime law at a company called Metcalfe & Co. in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Our firm focuses mostly on maritime law, a little bit of transportation law. We get to do a lot of fun things and I learn something new every couple of weeks. It's a great thing to be a part of. But I did start researching with RADSNAP back around 2018. I was a research assistant for OFI module law, and I'm sort of, kept poking my head up now and then, being like, can I still do something? Can I do something else? What next? So this time around, what next is I've written a chapter that sort of serves two purposes. One is to discuss the importance of a legal perspective when it comes to small-scale fisheries. Transdisciplinarianism, I can't believe I got that out in my first try, has been sort of a key discussion, one of those big connections that Evan has talked about a few times throughout this conference. And so I'm here to discuss the legal perspective and where that fits into all the other ones that we've been hearing about the last few days. And the second thing the chapter does, in order to discuss the importance of that legal perspective, I discuss why we should establish an operative legal definition or set thereof of small-scale fisheries in Canada. I know that might be a bit divisive. Some people think we don't need the definition at all. But the reality is, of course, that if you look for definitions of small-scale fishery in Canadian legislation, it's pretty sparse, mostly to the point of non-existence. And as we've heard through all the discussions today, there are a lot of examples of small-scale fisheries active in Canada. Are they regulated in the best way they could be in order to promote small-scale fisheries and in order to promote community-based fisheries and everything else? That's a bit more of a difficult question, and I think one route towards that is through a legal definition. So to speak about law just a little more, the Fisheries Act, of course, is our main statute regarding how the fisheries industry and the people it affects is regulated. It's one of the oldest statutes in Canada as we recognize it, because of course Canada was very much imposed over a number of different nations over 150 years ago that already existed at the time and had their own legal systems and cultures and societies already in place. So the Fisheries Act came out in the first year of Canada's existence. It's one of the oldest laws in the country and therefore has been rewritten and amended, and there's been repeals made, and there's been so many regulations put out underneath this act over the last 150 plus years. Regulations that affect fishers are also spread out in the Marine Liability Act, the Oceans Act 2001, the Income Tax Act, and the Employment Insurance Act as well. So if you want to approach, sort of a legal knowledge of fisheries and how they operate in Canada, you're going to have to look at a lot of different things, and sometimes in some unexpected places. So this is one way where a legal perspective can be helpful. Moving into some of the things I talked about in the chapter, there's sort of 4 characteristics of Canadian law I emphasize to help us understand why a legal definition of small-scale fisheries is important. The first of those is federalism. Canada operates as a federation, which means we have officially 1 central government and 10 provincial governments. We also have 3 territories, and they are delegated power from the federal government. Second, and related to federalism, is the concept of the division of powers. The Canadian Constitution prescribes different heads of power to either the federal government or the provincial government. And Section 91.12 of the Constitution Act states that sea coast and inland fisheries are the responsibility of the federal government. So we can discuss different things like how the federal government can delegate its powers through partnerships, federal-provincial partnerships, or set up independent administrative agencies, but as a large generalization, the federal government has the final authority over fisheries regulation. The third thing I bring to the front is multilateralism. So Canada is today recognized as a bilateral country. That means that we have common law operating across all the provinces of Canada, and we also have civil law operating in Quebec. These are 2 different legal systems. So we're recognized as a bilateral country wherein those legal systems work together. Multilateralism, to take that further, will consider the fact that Indigenous nations, as I said, have existed in this geographic area long before Canada itself, and they also have their own means of self-governance, self-determination, different legal systems, and our government sort of, there's an approach at the moment where rights to self-determination, self-governance, everything else are sort of something that the government's approach implies that they have to be awarded to people, where those are inherent rights, and the government should sort of, mostly take an approach of not preventing those people from just exercising their own laws. So multilateralism is the operation of Indigenous legal systems alongside the civil law and common law systems we have in place today. And I think one of the ways we can explore that is through fisheries development. And finally, Canada has international legal obligations. These include Canada's responsibility to other nations through NAFO, for instance, Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization. We have obligations through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as well. So all these things come together to sort of, give an example of why a legal perspective is necessary when it comes to governance and management of small-scale fisheries. So I advocate for establishing a definition or a set of regional definitions in small-scale fisheries. Because one of the reasons, as I mentioned, the federal government as final authority needs to have a way of developing small-scale fisheries, and it cannot do that if it does not decide what it is. So this can mean different things in different areas. You can put them in regional regulations. You can have one pan-Canadian definition, which will cause issues, of course. NAFO and the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, as two examples, are two groups with very different policies and very different reasons for approaching fisheries. So pan-Canadian definition may not work for them. It may be restrictive or an issue. So moving towards this definition, I think, is going to take a lot of participation. We have to give the Indigenous peoples of Canada room to decide whether they want to participate in a small-scale fishery regime and to what degree, or whether they would like to continue governance of their own fisheries and what that looks like. And if that's the case, we need to make sure that a small-scale fisheries regime doesn't actually overextend or capture Indigenous peoples in their own fisheries. So yeah, transdisciplinarism is important. My legal perspective is only as effective as the connections that are made between that perspective and all the other perspectives in the room today. And I think that's probably my time. I hope I didn't talk too fast.
I have a question for you.
Absolutely.
After we go first. How does a legal perspective help us bring recognition to small-scale fisheries in Canada, no matter what articulation?
A legal perspective can be used as a, and I think amongst, in a lot of different contexts, but legally educated people are going to recognize this phrase. It can be used as both a sword and a shield. So when it comes to discussing how a legal perspective can help, I think it's important to recognize that lawyers and legal professionals are trained to interpret this massive, vast body of laws and the history of them in order to pick out how they operate and to advocate for how they operate in certain ways. And so that can be used to sort of predict or approach how small-scale fisheries may be developed, how effective they may be, what challenges they might face. It can also be used to help protect small-scale fishermen when such operations start. And it can be used in developing laws that make sure that they're not too overbroad. They don't capture people or fisheries whom they shouldn't, but also that they are effective and that they can be used in a meaningful way to promote sustainable development and move forward from there. So that's one way, I think.
Sir, another question, Rob.
This is really interesting, and I agree it's very important to have a definition of terms. But from my experience, the word small scale fishery doesn't occur very much to date in our laws, even in our policies. But it's a suite. This conference, we're talking about a suite of things, including owner operator and rooted in community and those kinds of stuff. Will your chapter extend to that broader suite of things, and how will you sort of how will you define that scope?
Yeah, my chapter has not extended to that suite of things yet. Forgive me if maybe there's more time. You might get another draft as time goes on.
No, because this is just a starting point, right?
Yeah.
So the legal perspective is a way to broaden and cover that suite of things. So we bring those people together who can express their rights and different ways of thinking through legal systems in the room. Not to snag your answer.
No, that's just fine.
Yeah. We have another question here.
The court system, that's a bunch of crap to me. I know our nation, we've made a legal binding treaty agreement with the Crown. Even though those treaties that we made were illegal because they were forced on us by pointing a gun at our head and saying, sign or else. But we went to court, and I didn't want to go to court because if we're a nation, we have to deal with it nation to nation, with not to the courts. Because case in point, we went to court, wasn't too long ago, about logging in our territory. Like, we've got the right to log our own log lands, and they were stopping us. The government took us to court for 10 years, we went to court, and when it was almost getting time to settle it, the government seen they were gonna lose, so they closed the government. Now we're back in the same thing as when we started. That's what I mean. We shouldn't have to be going to court. And I don't agree. We're a nation. Canada is not a nation. They don't have no land base. Their land base is on a treaty agreement. That's all.
And that's, I think that's one of the issues. There's an inherent top-down approach. I think probably rather cruelly, another thing about the Constitution Act is that it also gives, federal government power to legislate over things such as seacoast and inland fisheries, or waterways and the oceans, that sort of thing, that are attached to the nation. It also declares that the federal government is responsible for the life of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So that's on its very face, that has its issues. And I think that's probably one of the, I think that reflects where it's reflected in issues like what you just mentioned, with the logging and that sort of thing. There shouldn't have to be a need to go to court, or there shouldn't have to be a need to keep revisiting treaties that were designed to, set these questions before, the government in some areas has been accused of reneging on. And I think this is where, hopefully, and we'll see how this works, where the word I used was multi-juralist perspective, where multi-juralism can come into play. So instead of just the colonial systems of civil law and common law that we see operating in colonial Canada, if we could give Indigenous laws their own room to breathe as well, and govern their own communities, that sort of thing, I think that could be very useful. And I'm hopeful we can see that in places like in fisheries development or in logging on your own territory. That's
Another point is Lake Superior isn't a part of our treaty. We didn't make a treaty to give up Lake Superior. That's right. So how do they have control over our lake when it's not part of the agreement?
It's there's the way I think the country was instituted, was sort of installed over 150 years ago. I think it was an issue at the time, of course, but we've really seen it play out today. In a lot of ways, like you just said, there shouldn't be certain control over certain areas of that sort of thing. And we're seeing problems with how the government can approach that, what tools it has to approach that, what tools it's used in the past, and of course, all the effects that has on Indigenous peoples as they try to work their management and to go through that slow process of government development over time. It's a tough question, and the progress is slow. And sometimes you wonder why you had to ask the question at all.
Right, thank you so much, Nate. So we will move on to Zaman Sajid, who's going to be talking about occupational health and safety in Canadian small-scale fisheries.
Hello everyone, my name is Zaman Sajid, and my book chapter is Are Canadian Small-Scale Fisheries Too Small to Ignore? A risk-based occupational health and safety perspective. This work is written with Alejandro as a co-author and Gerard Singh, who is my supervisor at Monash University. I think it is important to mention supervisor name when we have this presentation. So my background is in chemical engineering and process engineering. I used to work in occupational health and safety of oil and gas sector, especially offshore oil and gas sector. I was of the thought that this sector of oil and gas is very dangerous because we are dealing with the sophisticated techniques, we are dealing with the sophisticated processes in oil and gas, and we do have the oil and gas, which is a hydrocarbon, basically very explosive. But I was wrong in my understanding about this sector. But the truth is, our fisheries sector is more dangerous than oil and gas sector. So here I have some figures of the data. It is adopted from the Association of Workers' Compensation Board of Canada. According to them, in 2019, there were 42 fatalities in oil and gas sector, which is a very sad number, of course. However, in the same year, in fisheries, we have 118 fatalities in this sector, which is a very alarming situation for occupational health and safety of the people. Now, it is very hard to get some occupational health and safety data about the small scale fisheries, but I do have some links in the Safety Board Canada. And I got some data which I want to share with you and bring you a point where I can emphasize that the occupational health and safety of small scale fisheries is not that small that we can ignore it. So back in 2017, there were 3 people who lost their life in small scale fisheries. And in the next year, in 2018, 17 people lost their lives. And if I compare the data from 2011 to 2019, there were 10 fatalities per year. So this thing is indicating there is something wrong with our system where we are losing the people. So the main purpose of the work is just to earn your livelihood. It's not that you went to the work, you said good morning, goodbye to your family in the morning, but you're not coming alive at home in the evening. So that's something is very alarming to me and to my co-authors. So what we have done in this chapter, we have presented 2 thoughts, how we can prevent the accidents in small scale fisheries. The second important point that we have emphasized is how we can eliminate fatalities in small scale fisheries operations. And considering this, we have pointed out some risk factors which are very important to discuss when we are talking about the occupational health and safety in small scale fisheries. Along with this, we have provided some recommendations that can be helpful to the current governance system to control and mitigate the fatalities in this sector. Mainly our recommendations are based on safety guidelines, safety training, workers' health, and the design of a safe boat. So if you are interested to read more, I would encourage you to read this chapter when we have the hard launch of the book done. Okay, and that's all from my side. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer you.
John, just a comment, there was a fishing health and safety research that was done as part of the previous conference. On the website.
Yes, I did and put some section from that. Yes, it was very helpful. Yes.
Have you talked to them? Have you talked to
No, no. I think I should. It makes the second chapter for the
So good, we have some connections to make here.
Yes.
as a result of This book. Do we have,
Yes.
do we have a question for Samal? Still some thinking. So if something comes up to you, of course, we're.
So definitely, if you have any questions regarding occupational health and safety, so safety and risk engineering is basically my expertise. So I'm more than welcome to discuss this with you, and I'm definitely see you.
Bill Clark?
Yes. Thank you very much. Sir.
So now we have Evelyn Pinkerton, who will be embarrassed to hear that she's our heavy hitter at the end of the. We're so happy that she's been involved in the book and in our growing network. She's going to be talking about getting to owner-operator in the context of the Pacific fisheries. So Evelyn, are you ready to go? Thank you for joining us.
Sure. How is my sound?
Excellent.
Okay, great. I'm using a microphone. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, thinking big about small-scale fisheries really leads one to think about who owns the licenses and the boats that fish. And so that's what my talk is about. We've had huge problems on the West Coast with this issue, less on the East Coast. So the big news for us was in 2019 when FOPO, which you may know is the Parliamentary Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, did a study of the Pacific licensing system. Now, they did this study because you may think Greta Thunberg, basically the young fishermen of Victoria, went to Ottawa and persuaded them to do the study, said, we can't get into the fishery. That's what we want to do, but there's no way we can afford to get into the fishery. And so the report that came out from FOPO in May 2019 unanimously recommended, that means all parties who were on the committee, recommended that the Minister of Fisheries form an independent commission to figure out how to get a made in BC way to reform licensing and move to owner-operator. Now, why is owner-operator so important? Well, it's really hard to have a small-scale fishery if you can't have owner-operator in the inshore fishery. Meaning, I think most of you know that means that corporations can't own fishing licenses or the individual quotas, which often go with them. So in other words, fishermen must own the license that they fish. Now, moving to owner-operator in BC would be a radical change from the current situation, which I'll now describe a little bit briefly. So the next slide, please. So processing companies currently have gained significant ownership and control, for example, of salmon and herring fisheries, which are the pelagic fisheries. In these fisheries, processors capture and support and export these species to Asia and the U.S. for processing, leading to a huge loss of both fishing and fish processing jobs in BC. For example, in Prince Rupert, which had the last major cannery, there used to be 750 processing jobs until just a couple of years ago when that plant was closed because they export the canning to Asia and the U.S. where labor is cheaper. Excuse me. And basically now there are just 20 jobs year round and expanding to 50 in the summer, which is just unloading and loading fish. In other words, you unload the fish when it's delivered because it has to be delivered to Canada, but then you export it, you load it onto a ship that exports it somewhere else. So really scandalous if you think about it. And of course, halibut owner-operators have been reduced to 15% by 2016, only 16% halibut owner-operator ownership. And so ITQ, so halibut fisheries, unlike the salmon and herring on the West Coast, have ITQs, are required to have ITQs. And ITQ ownership is also moving away from fishers. And so that you may know that the neoliberal economists convinced DFO that ITQs would make fishing more efficient and relieve managers of the burden of decisions about access. Just let the market decide, they don't have to. And you probably know that individual quotas are a guaranteed part of the total allowable catch, which is permanently allocated to the individual and made transferable via the market as individual transferable quotas with no restrictions on who can buy or lease them. This is pretty dangerous because it means just about anybody can in any country. And ITQs are attached to licenses in the halibut fishery, and people who can't afford to buy ITQs can lease them, but they have to pay up to 80% of the value of the catch just to lease them. So this is unaffordable for new entrants. So halibut ITQs are now owned by investors and processors who bought them up from the original licensees and leased them out or broker the leases. And if you're a processor and broker the lease, you're requiring that they be delivered to you at your price. And so the East Coast is a little better off than we are on the West Coast, although you've heard lots of issues brought up about East Coast problems in the intro fishery at this conference. So, just wonderful presentations. I've really, really appreciated being here. So I think other papers have talked about these, so I'll just briefly go through. Fleet separation policy in 79, 89 owner-operator policies developed in all the East Coast regions. Montreal Protocol developed conditions under which ITQs could even be introduced. And then PIFCAF, this famous thing in 2007, which required that controlling agreements or trust agreements be ended by 2014 or risk non-renewable licenses, and this was challenged legally, but the challenge failed, and so there's been some pretty strong legal actions, and not only are these policies, but recently DFO's authority to enforce these policies have been greatly strengthened by not only legal decisions, but and reforms to the Fisheries Act, so the Fisheries Act has been amended so that the purposes that may be pursued by the minister include social, economic, and cultural factors, not just conservation. So this is a huge change, and it gives the minister a lot more ability on both coasts to enforce something like owner-operator. And so just to not be completely in despair about this, there is a process underway. There is at least some response of DFO to respond to the recommendations of the Parliamentary Committee on Fisheries. So here's what's happening. By July of 2021, DFO had convened an ad hoc committee to discuss how to implement the FOPO recommendations. Now, this is not an independent commission, as the FOPO said it should be, because it includes processors who have polar views from fishermen and fishermen leaders pushing for owner-operator. But at least DFO is doing something. And one thing that they have successfully agreed on is to start a license and quota registry. In other words, that requires the owners to declare who the beneficial owner is of the license. In other words, there'll be the declared license holder, then there'll be a shell company that actually owns the license, and then the real owner owns the shell company, which could be a foreign owner, or could be anybody, and could be any corporation, etc. So at least that's a first step in moving toward owner-operator. And the other step that's happened is that there's at least a discussion called shared risks and benefits between processors and fishermen leaders about regulating these ridiculous 80% quota lease fees for 80% in the halibut fishery. That's going to bankrupt fleets, and there'll be no fishery at all if that continues. So that has to stop. So at least there's some discussion of that, which is by no means the needed reforms, but at least it's a starting place. So just in conclusion, just remind everybody that the BC licensing policy problems currently are the collapse of the fisheries economies in coastal communities and the radical reduction of fishing and fish processing jobs. Number two, investors and corporations continue to consolidate ownership control and extract exorbitant rents from fishermen. And number three, government lacks socioeconomic information, including licensed beneficial ownership, and how it affects the stated policy goals, and how it limits competitive markets. And so at least there's now wider recognition of broad problems emerging from this situation and some policy of agreement on some initial solutions. And we're just waiting to see what DFO is going to do and how far it's going to go. And be great if anybody could just send a letter to the minister and saying, this is pretty darn important. So thank you for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Evelyn. Are there any questions for Evelyn? Or thoughts, anything? So I think they think you just solved everything. You have them all.
Right. Well, maybe they'll move on something then.
So we have Jen Ford who's going to ask a question for you.
Thanks. So I did have a question about some of your thoughts about transitioning, right? So you have a system now which you described.
I can't really hear the question if it's a question.
No, come, if you don't mind to come over closer to the mic. Yeah.
I think you had, can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, good, yeah. So I think you had, talked about sort of initial policy solutions, but I am curious about some of your thoughts about like alternatives or transition or solutions, because I mean, when a fishery becomes really capitalized, it's hard to think about how you would transition that to something else. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and in the chapter, this is discussed in more depth. It's really hard to cover it in 10 or 12 minutes. Yeah, there are a lot of good solutions there. Because I think your point is that some fishermen have bought ITQs, and so how did they get out of that? So one just very simple answer would be for the fisheries minister to make it illegal for quotas for ITQs to be sold to non-owner operators. In other words, processors could not buy ITQs. That would immediately change the market. It would lower the cost of ITQs. And there could be a 5-year transition period allowed. In other words, processors could be required to divest from ITQs and licenses, but they could be given 5 years to do that, which is considered a reasonable amount of time for any business to make that sort of adjustment. The other sorts of more helpful solutions would be moving toward a number of things. Licensed banks like the Northern Native Fishing Corporation in Prince Rupert, in which a licensed bank, owns licenses and leases them out at affordable prices to fishermen. So we already have that model here. We've got models from Alaska. We've got models on the East Coast in the shrimp fishery where there's a lot of involvement in Labrador, for example, what Paul Foley has written about, where there's a cooperative. There's this publication and a related publication that's coming out that discusses those solutions. So it's I guess my point here should just be that it's doable. We definitely know what we can do. It's just a question of whether we have the political will to do it. Does that help?
We have time for another question for Evelyn. Yes.
Evelyn, you know me, Bill Broderick here. We've met several times and you were working on this. I like what you've done, the work you've done with this, but to get back to the solutions, you talked about the, giving the time. Well, on the East Coast, they've done that. They've done that from 2006 to 2014, and it didn't work. It was supposed to be out of it. The companies were supposed to be out of it by 2014. So then we fast forward to 2021 when they come up with another rule that you got to be away from it. But what we're seeing is that when we first met, the problem you had in BC, we now have that in Newfoundland. We have the problem. We've imported the problem from you. Not your fault, but we now have it. And, every day, every license that changes hands is bought up somehow by fish companies. Even though we have all those nice agreements that people have to sign, and, you know, but we still have to the point that not one soul, not one young person got the wherewithal to buy a fishing license. They're outbid by a fishing company. They're still doing it. So the only solution that I see is the solution that you were talking about, is some way to freeze in time what happened and to try to work backwards from that with some sort of a bank that you can get those licenses into. I know it will take some money, but if we're going to bring those licenses and those quotas back into the hands of harvesters in the small boats throughout this country, government of Canada, I think, will have to take some responsibility and put some money, because they have failed us in terms of being able to protect the inshore. Money will have to be put up front because people have paid good money for those licenses and those quotas, so they will have to be reimbursed for that, and we'll have to find a way then to allow young people to be able to take those licenses and eventually finance them through banks and other mechanisms that there, and reasonable cost, because what's there right now is not reasonable cost. You heard people talk about today about buying. I heard your friends out in BC talk about years ago about paying exorbitant price for halibut. But when someone today says they're paying $55 a pound for crab in the water that I might catch next year and the year afterwards, that's outrageous. And I witnessed that. I saw that by two friends of mine doing that transaction just a short time ago. So we can't continue down that road. We will annihilate rural Canada if we continue down that road. So we have to have a mechanism. So thanks for the work that you do.
Yeah, I've heard of that in the lobster fishery, and the halibut fishery off the west coast of Newfoundland. The inshore fishery you've had wonderful success in Newfoundland with that fishery with the FFAW. What fisheries in particular are you talking about there that are in such trouble?
Evelyn, any of our fisheries that have quotas, individual quotas,
right,
assigned to. We don't have ITQs. We had one little smidgen of ITQs in the shrimp fishery in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That's the only one we had. But IQs are no different than ITQs. The T is not there, but it doesn't make a difference. But in the halibut fishery, we've done that with caps on it, the way we've done shrimp in Labrador that you talked about. We've done that with caps. So you couldn't buy it the same. That's how we've protected the halibut. We've done that ourselves through our union. But where we have competitive quotas, there's nothing to buy. But once you put an IQ on it, it becomes transferable, even though it isn't.
Yeah. I think your point about license banks being a good solution is a really strong one. And we've got examples of license banks a number of places. If it's of any help, I could send you some of the literature if you don't have it on those. They're really great. The Cape Cod one, there's one in California. There are quite a few good examples of license banks as a way of owning licenses collectively.
I'm Jean Anting, and I'm part of General Director of FRAP, based in Shippagan, New Brunswick, where I have a fleet of shrimpers, and those shrimpers were basically on the brink of bankruptcy. So we did manage to put up a fish bank corporation, which is based on a model from BC, actually. Dan Edwards, that you may know, did help us to put up that corporation in place. And now the fishermen now own collectively 7 of those shrimp licenses that we're able to purchase, and the shrimps are being redistributed to the fishermen, making them available to stay afloat. And so the system does work. And the comment that I would have regarding ITQs is we are about to reopen our redfish fishery and I would warn anybody at VFO not to institute this fishery on ITQ models, which the company wants. If we are to distribute the fisheries to some fishermen at the minimum, it could be an IQ fisheries. But this damn friggin' tea is a heck of a mess. If we do that, we're just instituting a mafia corporation.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Good for you.
All right, let's thank Evelyn for a great discussion. So Evelyn, we're gonna leave you up there so people can see you, okay? While we have a bigger conversation, just making sure you're aware. Ah, good, that's better. That's better. Okay. And so we can see her and she can see.
You don't want me to stop the video?
No, we'll stay there.
Stay right there. See, it's like you're in the room, Evelyn.
Okay.
See? Yeah. So these 4 chapters essentially are just little examples of what we have in the book, and you can see what kind of conversation is generated when we start to think about the kind of small-scale fisheries that exist in Canada. So it's quite exciting. Did you want to say something about your chapter? Something short? Did you want to? Just a little quick overview.
Very impromptu, but thanks.
Okay.
Barry Darby and I'm Helen Forsey. Barry Darby and I submitted a chapter that we called Echoes, traditional outport fishing in Newfoundland and Labrador and Indigenous approaches to harvesting. And we actually had written quite a bit about some of the parallels and echoes, similarities between some of the methodologies and I guess you'd say approaches, some of the commonalities between traditional outport communities and the way they depend on and live in and are part of the environment and the ecosystem there. And comparing that with especially experiences I've had with friends who are Indigenous harvesters in Ontario who have a whole different framework for what they do. And but there are parallels, and we had initially focused too much on the parallels, and we got told actually by some people from the Saugeen Ojibwe people who were here until this morning. We were reminded that it's not, you can't just compare them. It's 2 completely different frameworks for looking at harvesting. And that, I guess our conclusion was we, non-Indigenous people, need to draw from the Indigenous, put the knowledge that we have from our own history and our own science and that sort of thing, and put it into this more holistic, different, all-embracing framework of that the Indigenous way embodies, or we're just tilting it. It won't work unless we put it into that kind of framework. So that was what we ended up with. Recognizing echoes, but saying that we need to insert what we know, what we do into this larger, wiser framework that's been developing for millennia.
Did you get who that was?
Some of the chapters in this book, like Helen and Barry's, are just so close to completion. So I talked about today's very soft one, soft as you can get. And then a hard launch coming in a few months. Actually, we're going to be adding chapters because it's an ebook and we know the publisher. So we're going to be adding chapters as they're ready. So it's going to be, that's one way that this is not a product necessarily, although there will be a free and open access output to it, but it's a process. So we'll be able to engage with people through as we add groups of chapters up, like Helen and Barry's and others who are presenting around in this Congress, as a way to just keep people engaged. So my hope is that between today's session and also tomorrow's meet and greet, that we could start to talk a little bit more about who might be interested in still joining the ebook, because we still have a couple months left to do that, particularly if you like to move fast. And there'll be no major revisions, so don't worry. It's about your voice, your perspective, but we do try to fit a little bit into the book. Sarah.
Can you tell us about the meet and greet? What is that?
Oh yes, the meet and greet tomorrow is 1 hour before we start. 9 o'clock, so 9 to 10, right up into the reception. And there's nothing to do, but just come and talk about small-scale fisheries in Canada. Find me, Christine, Lathana, or people like Sarah, and talk about how you might want to get involved and what we should do, because this is not about the ebook necessarily, it's about the network that we're building. So many of you have been involved in big networks with different kinds of people. And so this is also a chance to learn a little bit about that. So that's something that, for example, Rosemary Omer, who contributed a chapter focused on some lessons from coasts under stress. Also, there's other people here. So I'm gonna put you on the spot, Rob, if that's okay. Not to make you commit to anything, although you have to. Is to say, in your experience with the Canadian Fisheries Research Network, and you look and you're hearing a little bit about the diversity and heterogeneity in this network, but also about the ambitious goals that we have. What should we do? What should our next steps be as an emerging network that seeks to involve all sorts of different people and also be policy relevant?
That is on the spot, Evan. Thank you. Hello, Lynn. Rob, good to see you. Well, I had a great pleasure of working with many people in this room and many others on the Canadian Fisheries Research Network, which was established to bring academics together with fish harvesters and government in collaborative work that could not be done by one or even two groups alone. It required all three. And it turned out in hatching the plan for that network, that there were several issues that required all three, and there was no way of getting to that without establishing a collaboration. So we got some funding to do that. A few lessons, and it's described in a couple of papers, including one that Susan Thompson led, that's in the Canadian Journal of Fisheries. But one thing was, we spent quite a bit of time doing what we're doing in the margins of this meeting, talking to one another about what are the issues that need the network. Why do you need a network? If one or two people can do it, let them do it. But what are those things, those critical things, that cannot be done without all hands on deck, without all hands together? And indeed, there are some. And then who to have in the room, and we were limited by money and by time and by energy, but we tried to put together a collaboration that would work in each of in our case, it's not what anyone else would have to do, but in our case, it required that all three parties worked meaningfully together. So we co-constructed those projects purposefully together from the ground up, co-constructed. And if not everybody bought into it, then it had to keep being discussed until people did it. Buying into it was with memorandum of understanding. We agree we're coming together to work on this issue. There was an awful lot, I have to say, of what I refer to flippantly as the head bobbing and bill clapping. You know, to get to know one another and to try to feel comfortable about this enterprise. Because we came from really different perspectives, industry, academia, government, even within academia, social sciences, natural sciences. It took a long time to get people to be able to speak a common language, to focus on a common question, not to beat one another up about the words they were using, etc. It was tough. At the beginning, we wondered sometimes whether it was going to go off through rails, but it didn't. It didn't. It stayed together, and it produced some really good stuff. Portfolio of products. We talked about bundles of products, academic products, which the students working on the network have to provide for their theses, but also products for the wharf, because it was largely built around industry questions, and also products for the general public, a bundle of products produced in different ways. Anyway, there are many more lessons, but I think the conversations about here, about what are the big things to work on, and then how would we do it? It's a no-brainer, really. It has to be done. Fixing or improving, let's say, governance, especially given, not that necessarily that it's been wrong to date, but we need to do something about governing through change. There's no more compelling problem in my view than that. Hope that's useful. Thank you.
So I'm not gonna put anybody on the spot, or maybe I will. I know that there are some people in here, particularly because I heard your presentations during the governance, getting governance right plenary, where you have this mix of work that is very science relevant, very good, strong research, but also is about trying to make change. And so if you do this work that way, a little bit of science, a little bit of advocacy, all nested in good, critical, deliberate thinking, how does a network like SSF can bridge these two goals that are often seen as separate or not incommensurable, particularly in academia? So Evelyn, I know you do a lot of work with and on behalf of fishers. Could you talk about that? Any lessons from your career that we can take on in this network in fighting a good fight as well as doing great science?
Could you be a little more specific in the question? I didn't hear it very well.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your career and fighting and working with and on behalf of fishers, but also meeting some of those more scientific metrics, publishing and doing things that keep scientific networks seen as impactful.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'm not quite sure where to start on it. I mean, one really simple thing is to co-author papers with fishermen, so that they have a lot of input into what you say. I know lots of academics have changed their thinking and their presentation a lot through co-authoring with fishermen. So that's just one really simple thing. You mentioned Dan Edwards earlier, and I worked with him and a number of other people on starting a management. We attempted to create a management board on the west coast of Vancouver Island in BC, and those kinds of efforts are really valuable. A very interesting outcome of that is that it was an Indigenous, non-Indigenous collaboration. So all those fishing communities that felt abandoned by government came together and worked together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous together. And what's happening now is that the Indigenous work is being funded now. Their Indigenous management issues are being funded, and non-Indigenous are not. And so what's really curious now is that the Indigenous communities on the west coast of Vancouver Island are saying, well, we don't think you should abandon our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so really interesting things happening there. That being a tension that we've heard here today. And so there's so many things. I kind of don't know where to begin. It would help if there were a more specific question.
Well, I will borrow some time over Zoom and we can go back and forth some more if we do.
Okay.
Thank you. So all of you are working with different people about fisheries issues. If you envision a network called Small-Scale Fisheries in Canada, what kind of perspectives and stories would you like to see involved in that? Yeah, Sarah.
I just really like the idea of something that brings perspectives from most of these topics, because I think there are so many issues, and we've heard some of them here, where they're similar but different issues, and there's so much that we can learn, but like we're so many miles apart, and I very rarely make it to these schools, and I do know that they're bad. I think just making that effort to connect across geographies would be super valuable, but would also make the small scale networks feel smaller and more impactful.
Yes.
I would add that the way we do things right now, we manage per species. DFO manage per species. So you have the shrimp, the snow crab, the lobster, the herring, whatever, it's all per species. And if you start the discussion with the side effects or the other species, then you're not at your place. And who's chairing the committee will shut you up. So you have those advisory committee, which I think no longer works because it's a closed shop and you don't know what's going up after. And we just heard this morning about an ecosystem approach. We've been requesting that for quite a while now. I think that everybody in fisheries, every fisherman knows that the other species with the bycatch of what he's doing is of right importance. And except the fact that DFO don't want to talk about bycatch because it's like a crime. If you bring bycatch on your boat, you're kind of a killer, which in my view doesn't make any sense. But to enlarge the discussion, and that's a recommendation that last week I had a chance of appear before FOPO. We were talking about FOPO, and FOPO had is doing actually a study on science at DFO. And our recommendation that we presented from our organization to FOPO is that on at least a biannual or triannual mode, maybe should be annual, that would be a gathering of the fishing industry. And it could be a national affair, or we could split it in half and have something on the West Coast and something on the East Coast. But at least to have in one room, in one event, the fishing industry of Canada talking to each other about the challenge that's there. Obviously, DFO has to be the major player of that, to being the processors, the fishermen, the experts. So, because right now science is mainly controlled by DFO, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's some kind of a silo affair. And alongside of that, you have some university doing some work, you have some research workers that do some science, but that doesn't talk to each other. Somebody's publishing a document, but who's reading it? Who knows about it? So that's what I'm saying. We definitively need to create this type of place of conference that the fishing industry of Canada do talk to each other, and then from there, we can at least see not only my part of the wood, but the whole forest. Because right now, the only thing we do is look at one tree. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Good suggestion about some processes to think about and contribute to. So we have a few minutes left. And I'm going to, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha Tamburello. I'm a transplant from academia to industry, I guess. I'm an environmental consultant. And I just wanted to riff a bit on this theme of not speaking the same language and siloing, because I often now feel a bit out of place at these conferences. But consultants are often in a unique position of working for clients from all of these different sectors, and we end up playing a bit of a role of cross-pollination by bringing ideas from one sector to another when people don't often talk to each other. So, you know, we do a lot of work directly for First Nations clients and for DFO, and we sometimes end up unofficially serving as that back channel, which is an interesting position to be in. And I do think it's important to engage this community in the network, because we're often the ones who are called upon to operationalize the theory that is coming out in the literature, and these suggestions for best practices. We're sort of the ones who are engaged by these organizations in the room, facilitating these meetings and trying to actually like make it work on the ground. And I think there's so much to be learned there that never really is documented or makes it into the literature, just because of the nature of the work we do and how we spend our time. But I do think there's a lot of really valuable lessons that can be learned there. And the other thing I wanted to say about speaking the same language and silos is I do think, you know, something the network could do is think a little bit more and provide some advice into how we're training the next generation of scientists working in this field to be more transdisciplinary in the way they are taught. So I have a nice example. I was fortunate to attend a short course taught by Dr. Deborah Curran in the UVic Faculty of Law at the Banfield Marine Sciences Center on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It was a new course, and it was sort of like a tripartite teaching model. It was a course on environmental and Indigenous law that was half environmental science students, half law students, and it was co-taught by Faculty of Environment, Faculty of Law, and the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations. It was on their traditional territory. And it was an extremely eye-opening experience for me, coming from a pure environment background, to like understand what the law even is and how it works. And it underpins and it imposes its structure on so much of the work that all of us do, but so few of us have a real understanding of what it is or its context. And I would say the same also for Indigenous law. And I think, you know, having that kind of model is really helping people to speak the same language from the earliest parts of their career, and not in a way where like environmental science students are taught law and vice versa, but learning from each other in the course was such a productive model for not only understanding each other's language and being able to work more productively in the future, but also I think has forged like a network and partnerships where you can work together or call on each other for that expertise in your future work. So I just think that's it was a really amazing experience and model that I think should be reproduced elsewhere.
So you can write a chapter on the role.
I would love to do that.
I'm serious. So we'll talk, you just stay right there and we'll talk after this session. Thank you so much. Okay, so there's an example of what we're doing. All is welcome, everybody included, good perspectives. We will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Light, meet and greet, coffee, chatting more about where we started here today. And if anything, we just gather some contact information and I can reach out to you and see what we can do over the next few months. And if not then, certainly in the future. So thank you so much for joining today and helping start Think Big about small-scale fisheries in Canada. Have a great rest of your conference. Thank you.